Okay. Hello, everyone. This is Mark Yarnell. I'm a senior advocate with Refugees International, and hope everyone's having a good Thursday afternoon, and really glad you can join for this. I'm going to give a brief on the recent mission that my colleague Michel Gabaudan, or our Vice President Michel Gabaudan, and myself took to Kenya and Somalia. But first of all, I just want to thank you so much for participating today, for your interest in these issues, and for your support to RI. We really could not do this work without you. So we just know how much that we appreciate that. Again, in September, I spent about 2 weeks with RI's President Michel Gabaudan. Um, in May of this year, the Kenyan government announced that it was going to shut down the Dadaab refugee camp, home to several 100,000 Somali refugees. And we wanted to be able to go and understand what was happening, see for ourselves what kind of pressure refugees were facing to leave Dadaab, and then look at the context they were facing inside Somalia. So I'm going to just give a brief sort of 15-minute presentation with a slideshow and show you some of what we encountered and some of our key conclusions, and then would be very happy to take any questions. Um, Though you're not able to speak, the microphones are muted. There's a taskbar on the left where you can type in messages to ask questions. So I will be encouraging questions once the presentation is over. So this is an aerial photo of the Dadaab refugee complex. Um, it is as you can see, a massive sprawling camp in northeast Kenya, just south of the Somali border. It opened in 1992 after Somalia descended into civil war following the downfall of the Siad Barre regime, who was leader at the time, and since then has received periodic waves of Somali refugees due to ongoing conflict and to food insecurity inside Somalia. Most recently, there was a famine in Somalia in 2011 and 2012, which caused huge numbers of people fleeing across the border to seek life-saving assistance at the Dadaab camp that you see here. Um, and at present, there's around 270,000 refugees living in Dadaab, the vast majority from Somalia. Just to put it into context, it's basically the size of Kenya's third largest city if you compared it to just a bit smaller than not as big as Nairobi and Mombasa, but bigger than Kisumu. So it's the size of a city, but even though it's been there for 2 decades and you have even tens of thousands of people born in the camp, Kenya treats Dadaab very much like a temporary settlement. So there's no permanent infrastructure, there's no electric or plumbing systems, no paved roads, and based on Kenyan law, refugees don't have the right to work, except for some minimal short-term employment with aid organizations. So by no means is Dadaab a nice sort of hospitable necessarily place to live. But as long as Somalia remains in turmoil and there is violence and severe food insecurity there, and short of other solutions, it does offer a place for people to receive basic services like food and healthcare, shelter, and education, which is so important. So unfortunately, in May of this year, citing national security concerns, the government of Kenya announced that it wanted to close the Dadaab entirely by the end of November, which is the date was yesterday, with no alternatives except for refugees to return to Somalia. The government has extended this deadline by 6 months. So while they initially said they were going to close it in end of November, now they're saying they'll close it by the end of May 2017. So kick the can down down the road a little bit, but still the key problems remain. And I think just in terms of understanding why Kenya made this pronouncement, I think that they made the announcement saying that it was based on security concerns, and Kenya does face real security challenges. There have been major attacks in Kenya linked to the al-Shabaab terrorist group, which controls territory throughout much of Somalia. But none of those attacks have been attributed to anyone within the refugee population, let alone to the Dadaab refugee camp with any evidence we've seen. And I think a more kind of accepted explanation is that Kenya is moving towards national elections in August of 2017, and the current president, made this announcement just shortly after he announced his campaign for re-election. And I think that it's certainly much easier to scapegoat the refugee population for security problems. And I think what's so unfortunate is that these are people who themselves fled the insecurity. Many of them fled the insecurity from al-Shabaab. I mean, and the key issue here too is about choice. With the announced closure of the camp and with the only option for refugees to return, they're basically not being given a choice in terms of whether they can stay in Kenya or not. And the UN Refugee Agency, which is mandated to protect refugees, has a very clear principles that returns should only be of a voluntary nature, by choice, if someone still has refugee status, and that no one should be forced back into a context where they still face threats to their lives. And I think what's tough here is that while Kenya isn't coming in with trucks and physically forcing people across the border, they've been engaged in a very serious fear campaign to put pressure on refugees, make them feel less comfortable in Dadaab. And at the same time, the UN Refugee Agency is offering sort of a higher monetary package for people to return, basically like an inducement. And so we're seeing a situation of coercion to return into Somalia, into a context that is still very unstable, and we think returns are not necessarily sustainable. So that's the overall context, and I'm just going to move through some slides, and again look forward to answering any questions you have after the brief presentation. Just to show on a map where we traveled to, you can see the Dadaab refugee camp in the northeast area of Kenya, just south of the Somali border. So we spent time in Dadaab meeting with refugees to understand the threats that they're facing and the decision they're trying to make. We also traveled to Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia, and then we went south to Kismayo. If you follow the coast a bit further south, Kismayo is the capital of Jubaland, a region in southern Somalia, and thus far about 35,000 refugees have been facilitated by the UN to return to Somalia with their return program, and the vast majority have arrived in Kismayo, so that we wanted to go there and understand the context into which people are arriving. So you saw the aerial view of Dadaab. This is a much closer shot. You can see some of the tents in the background and some of the thorny bushes that people use as sort of security fences around their compounds. And then right at the bottom of the screen is a plot where a family had previously lived, but they have since taken up the plot and taken their belongings and moved back to Somalia. We tried to meet with as many refugees as we could over several days in Dadaab to understand how they were feeling and what they were experiencing in terms of the threatened closure and the repatriation program. And virtually every refugee we spoke with said that returns are not by choice, that they are experiencing a very severe campaign of intimidation by the government. They told us of threats from the government officials that are broadcast throughout the camp on radio programs, basically calling refugees better leave or else. One refugee said that he was worried that, quote, the government will beat us or set the camp on fire if we don't leave. And again, we don't know how Kenya might behave in the next few months, but certainly it was palpable that they'd instilled a significant level of fear into refugees, and that was something that was just prominent throughout the interviews we conducted. The other piece to this is that after the Kenyan government announced the intention to close the camp in order to instigate higher numbers of returns, the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, increased the return package for people to go back to Somalia. So basically, now refugees receive about $200 per person when they leave Somalia, and they leave Dadaab, and then when they arrive in Somalia, another $200, and then a subsequent subsidization package that lasts about 6 months. And as you can see, there's posters that are affixed to the walls of this this area where refugees can go to learn more about the return process, and it clearly says return is my choice. But when we spoke to refugees, we heard a very different story. This is a woman who is depicted on the front cover of our report, the field report we recently produced, and she told us that she was hearing from friends and contacts inside southern Somalia, where she's from, that there's still major insecurity and fighting. There's very limited access to healthcare, to school, very few jobs available. So she didn't want to go back to Somalia, but she was signing up for the return package because she feared that if she did not sign up for it and take the package, then she'd be punished by the Kenyans if or when the camp closed. And she said to us, quote, "This is about fear. It's not about choice." We spoke with some students who are in Dadaab, and I think, again, as difficult as life can be in Dadaab sometimes, it is important that there are opportunities for education, and this is a secondary school inside the camp for refugee students. And one of the headmasters told us that they'd previously had enrollment of about 95%, but that once the camp closure announcement was made, that dropped down to 50%, because many students, certainly some students had left with their families to go back to Somalia, but many other students just felt that there was no more point to going to school if they were going to be returned to Somalia, where the limits for education are so the options for education are so limited. And I mean, it just completely broke my heart speaking to these three students. They told us that, you know, one of the few ways to get out of Dadaab is to do well enough in your high school exams that you can potentially win a scholarship to a university somewhere in Kenya, and that gives you more options for your future and gets you into other parts of Kenya. And they said to us that, quote, you know, now all those dreams have come to an end with the camp closure announcement. And they said to us, they said, you know, the UN Refugee Agency is telling us that there is a choice, that returns are voluntary, but if there's a deadline for closing the camp and there's no other option, how can this be voluntary? And that's the key issue, and that's what the discussions we're engaged in now with the Kenyans and with the UN Refugee Agency. But the bottom line here, I think, is that, you know, even if ultimately this closure announcement turns out to be a threat, and in 6 months Kenya backs away again, the mere announcement of the closure is already causing some pretty significant harm to the people who live there. And certainly there are many people who have fled with their families to returned with their families back to Somalia, and then found it so difficult or insecure that they've come back to Dadaab. This is a young man named Mohammed who's 17, and he had been living in Dadaab for about 8 years with his family. They then decided to take the return package and go back to southern Somalia. His family was then threatened by the al-Shabaab terrorist group, which again controls much of the rural areas inside Somalia. And his parents were worried that he might be targeted for recruitment by al-Shabaab if he stayed in Somalia. So he actually came back to Kenya and came back to Dadaab and told us that all he wants to do is get back into school and take the year-end exams and live in a safe place. One tragic side of the story is that when the government announced they were closing Dadaab, they completely disbanded the Department of Refugee Affairs, which plays the role of registering new arrivals and if registering refugees so that you can have access to shelter and to food rations. And so now that the Department of Refugee Affairs no longer exists, Mohammed isn't able to re-register, and so basically he is now dependent on friends and other people in the camp to share their rations with him. And this is just one of many people we met who had gone to Somalia in an effort to return and then fled back into Kenya because they face continued violence there. So again, just wanted to show on the map, in addition to visiting Dadaab, we wanted to go into Somalia to look at the kinds of conditions people are living in, and the context into which they're returning. And just to reiterate, Kismayo is the location to where the majority of refugees have returned. I think about 18,000 of the 35,000 or so who have gone back through the UN's program. This is just an overview aerial shot of Kismayo as we were flying in, and of the port in the main town area. And until 2012, Kismayo was controlled by al-Shabaab and was actually the headquarters of al-Shabaab. And in 2012, the Kenyan military forced the terrorist group out. And so now, while the city itself is relatively safe, Shabaab is still present just in about a 10 to 15 kilometer. As soon as you get about 10 to 15 kilometers outside of the city, they control the territory and all the rural areas. So it's still a very dangerous place to operate, and there's very limited access for aid organizations outside the city itself. And this is just a shot of when we were driving from the airport into the town a few kilometers, just to show how arid the land is. Unfortunately, Somalia, which again experienced a famine in 2011, is now going through recurrent drought, and there's about 5 million people who are in need of emergency food aid. So in addition to the insecurity, the region is experiencing climatic challenges. And just from the context of refugee returns, refugees are being returned not into a place that is conducive to receiving them and to reintegrating them into the communities, but they're basically being returned into a place that is itself experiencing a humanitarian crisis. So we went to these are refugees who had recently come back to Somalia, and this is basically a way station run by the UN Refugee Agency, implemented through an NGO partner, where refugees receive basically a monetary return package. And again, they get a fairly good amount of money in terms of money upon departure and money upon arrival, and then continue to receive about $200 per family for about 6 months as a subsidy to help reintegration. The problem is that there is a lack of available jobs. There's lack of access to education, other services like healthcare, clean water. Because of the continuing insecurity in the rural areas, people who had once pursued agripastoral livelihoods aren't able to restart that. So there's a great deal of anxiety about what will happen once that 6 months of support runs out, whether people will end up living in internal displacement camps dependent on humanitarian aid, or if they'll end up going right back to Dadaab. And indeed, this is a group of women who were speaking with RI's president, Michel Gabaudan, at this way station, and were quite despondent about the situation into which they'd arrived, and said that had they known, at the time what they know now about what they were coming into, they would not have made the decision to return to Somalia, and they were most worried about the future for their children, especially since education options were so limited. And again, some talked about potentially going back to Dadaab. And here again, as I said, Somalia and Kismayo itself is at the heart of a humanitarian crisis. And so this is a camp not for refugees, but a camp for people who have been displaced internally from other places in Somalia and who came to Kismayo, to this camp, to receive assistance. There's about 40,000 people displaced internally living in various camps around Kismayo. And unfortunately, as I said earlier, about there's already a number of people returned from Dadaab who are not able to integrate into local communities, and then themselves move into these IDP camps to receive assistance. So basically going from becoming a refugee to becoming an IDP. And this is just some of the children in the IDP camp. It's just kind of overwhelming how many kids are there without access to education. And this is a mix of both children who are part of the internal displacement population, as well as children of families who had returned, refugees who had returned to Somalia. So this is sort of a overview of what we encountered and some of our key findings. So just in terms of some of the key recommendations we're focusing on and working on the months ahead, even though Kenya lifted the November deadline, they're now working on a deadline that is in May of 2017, and Kenya's national elections will be in August of 2017, so it's an even more politically charged environment. So we're working aggressively to push for Kenya both to lift that deadline for closure and also reinstitute the refugee agency that can, within its government, that can register people who are either new arrivals to Dadaab or people who have gone back to Somalia and then returned to Dadaab. And then, of course, because there are still about 270,000 refugees in the camp in Dadaab, we're trying to push UNHCR to improve services there so that there isn't just attention and resources going towards the repatriation program. And then finally, just more time for development inside Somalia. There's despite the ongoing humanitarian crisis inside Somalia, there are some good efforts at increasing stability, at bringing in development actors like the World Bank. The Somali government has approved a very well-structured and ambitious national development plan. But it takes time for those development efforts to take hold. And I think with a premature mass return of refugees, that could very much destabilize those development efforts, let alone cause returns that are not sustainable. So these are the main things we're working on. Just came today from meeting with staff at the State Department, and we'll be on the phone tomorrow with high-level staff from the UN Refugee Agency and continuing to push on this, and we'll continue to work on it for the next months ahead, certainly. So anyways, thank you so much for listening patiently. And again, to ask questions, there's the box below, and you can probably just see that there's a message on the left there to show where you can type in your questions, and happy to answer any questions. All right, so a question from Tom about whether those who are leaving Dadaab are all going back to Somalia or some going elsewhere. Certainly the majority are going to Somalia, but honestly, for some people we spoke with, they said that if Dadaab truly is going to close, and because they feel like Somalia is still too insecure to return to, they very well may take the money and try to make it all the way to Europe and follow the migration path that's quite dangerous through Libya and into Italy. So this push to close Dadaab is definitely going to push movement to many other places, not just returns to Somalia. Thanks for that, Tom. Any other questions? You're welcome, Tom. I'll just give it another little bit to see if there's any questions. That's a great question. Are there any other places in Somalia that they can go? That's a great question. The UN has established 9 areas within Somalia for return, including Mogadishu, the capital, and a couple other cities a bit further north. Part of the reason, though, that most people are returning to Kismayo is because many of them are from Kismayo and the areas around there. And despite how difficult it is to operate in Kismayo, it's still better than many of the other locations. Some locations, even the cities, aren't safe enough for the UN to set up support systems. So yes, there are other places people can go, and certainly refugees who have their own networks and safety connections can return and try to reintegrate. But in terms of where the UN can set up support for returns, Kismayo is one of the better locations, despite how difficult it still is. And then just for context as well, I think in addition to the drought that Somalia is facing and the continued fighting with al-Shabaab, it's coming up on an election that the government is trying to hold before the end of the year, and that potentially could cause more turmoil within the country. Any other questions? If there are no other questions, then happy to wrap up and let everyone enjoy their evenings. And I'm always happy to be in touch if there's questions anyone has that they want to follow up. My email is, I don't have it on the slide here, but it's quite easy. Just mark@refugeesinternational.org, and that's Mark with a K. And again, I really appreciate your support and your interest in these issues. And one more question from Eileen. I do think it helped. I think what was good is that we engaged in this issue very aggressively. I think that it was helpful that we also worked in coordination and coalition with some other groups that were pushing on similar issues like Amnesty International and like Human Rights Watch. So I think it's been good to be working as a consolidated group. And I think the government's paying attention. I think UNHCR itself is also paying attention. And that's part of the reason why we're going to have a call with them tomorrow. So I think that the advocacy as a whole has been helpful in showing that we're watching, that we are engaged in a serious way, and that there will be hell to pay if Kenya does move in a serious way to force closure of the camp and force people across the border. But again, we don't want to rest because the deadline is only 6 months down the road, and unfortunately, Somalia won't be much improved by then. And so, I think watching to see what happens over the next few months will be just as critical. Excellent. Well, thanks so much again, and again, happy to be in touch if there's any other follow-up questions, and please keep following our work on this. Thanks everyone, and have a great evening.